Hello, good day. Sir Howard here. Welcome to our new episode dito sa Libreng Sit-In. This time, we are talking about the field of psychometrics. For today, ang pag-uusapan natin is the short history of psychometrics. I want to emphasize on the words short history. Hindi ito comprehensive history ng psychometrics because I think we are going to run out of time if we discuss everything. So everything that I'm going to discuss here, very summarized version of the history of psychometrics, I will only focus on the events, on the people, which I think are very important in understanding the current state of psychometrics today. So kung gusto nyo na talagang malaliman o talagang maraming concepts na matutunan on the history of psychometrics, you can just read any textbooks na merong chapter on the history of psychological testing. Again, this episode is just a very summarized version of the field of psychometrics. The following are the skills that I want you to learn for this video. Number 1, narrate key historical events in the field of psychometrics. Dapat bilang isang psych major, marunong ka o alam mo kung ano yung iba't ibang mga pangyayari in history that contributed big time to the current state of psychometrics here in the Philippines and in the world. Number 2, identify and name the contribution of a key person in the field of psychometrics. More than the events, more than the dates, isa pang dapat nyong ma-master are the different names, different characters that are very important that contributed big time, again, to the state of psychometrics. Dapat marami kayong alam na mga names ng mga tao na talagang nakakontribute sa field of psychometrics. Now, the history of psychological testing, usually when you read this in different textbooks, usually it's divided in two tracks. Merong dalawang landas yung history ng psychological testing, iba yung history ng intelligence testing, iba pa yung history ng personality testing. For this video, I am going to focus on the history of intelligence testing, yung history for personality testing, that will be discussed in a separate video. No? Gagawa natin ng separate lesson yan. So let's now talk about the key events and very popular people, big names in the field of intelligence testing. The first thing that you need to know about psychological testing is this process of measuring something in the mind of a person started very early. Huwag niyong isipin na yung psychometrics is the invention of modern day psychology, yung kamakailan lang na imbento. That's not true. In fact, if you study history, there are already evidences that show psychological testing is already being done even 2,000 years ago. For example, specifically in China, meron silang mga nakitang mga evidence na meron ng forms of psychological testing during those times in that place. Specifically during the Han Dynasty, nakakita sila ng isang ancient painting, this one, that's the painting, where seemingly yung nangyayari sa painting, merong nagaganap na psychological testing. Okay? Now, specifically, during this time, according to historians, psychological testing was being used for government service. This is our own version today of civil service exam. Before you join the government, before you can work with the government, kinakailangan mo munang patunayan yung competence mo doon sa gobyerno that you have the psychological skills to be a government official. No? So you take the civil service exam. So again, during the Han Dynasty, merong evidence that they are already doing something like this, which can be considered a form of psychological testing. Now, you may ask, ano ba yung mga skills that they were trying to measure during those times if you want to serve the Chinese government? The following: music, archery, horsemanship, arithmetic, and verbal reasoning. So, this will give you a clue kung ano ba yung mga psychological skills na mahalaga during those times in the traditional Chinese society. They value this so much that you have to prove first that you have all this before you can serve the Chinese government. The thing is, although merong psychological testing na naganap in China, the events related to psychometrics in China, wala masyadong malakas na impact in the overall field of psychometrics. But there is this one place in the map where the key events that really moved the history of psychometrics forward, ito yung Europe. Yung Europe talaga, dyan naganap yung marami mga events, historical events that really moved forward the story or the history of psychometrics, specifically in France. So these are the following pictures of people and events that we are going to talk about in this video that will show to us a short story of the field of psychometrics. It all started in France, tulad ng sinabi natin kanina, where the first need for intelligence test was made. During the 1830s kasi, nakita ng mga education experts sa France that a lot of their students entering school are failing their subjects. Mabababa yung kanilang mga grades. They are not getting the most out of their French education. And this is bad for two reasons. Number one, syempre nakakahiya yan. Kapag nakilala yung bansa mo as a country where students are not excelling, it's a big disgrace for that country. Number two, it's also a waste of resources. Imagine if the government is funding the education of the youth, but the youth are not getting the most, are not getting the benefits of education kasi nga binabagsak nila, nasasayang lang yung pondo that the government is putting into the education system. So nagkaroon ng meeting yung mga French government officials, no, to talk about the problem, and they came up with a solution to this problem. Ang sabi nila, we need to only accept those students who are deserving or who are competent to enter school. Because during those times when they were having this problem, wala pang screening. Basically, everyone can enter the school system. Ang problema in that approach, not all kids who enter the school system already have the cognitive ability or the intellectual ability para makapasa siya sa eskwelahan. So sabi nila, magkaroon na lang tayo ng screening. Huwag nating tanggapin lahat. Magkaroon tayo ng pagsasala sa Tagalog, no? Tatanggapin lang natin yung mga estudyante na meron talagang kakayanan to benefit from the education system. But before they can do this, of course, they need a tool that will tell them who are the students who are ready and who are the students who are not yet ready to enter the school. Doon na ngayon nila naisip na gumawa ng isang test that will measure intelligence of students for them to know kung sino ang tatanggapin, kung sino ang hindi tatanggapin. And this is where Francis Galton enters the picture. Si Francis Galton, if there's one thing you need to know about him, he was an expert in intelligence testing. One of his passions yan. Yung kanyang mga research, yung kanyang mga intellectual pursuits, it's all about understanding human intelligence. But one thing that stands out from Galton is how he defines intelligence. Kakaiba yung pananaw niya sa intelligence. For Francis Galton, he believes the sensory motor view of intelligence. Ibig sabihin ng sensory motor, your intelligence highly depends on how good your sensory motor skills are. If you want to know how intelligent a person is, ang gagawin ni Galton, itetest niya yung iyong sensory motor skills. Sensory motor is a compound word, combination of two words. Sensory means what? How well do your five senses work? Motor means how well do your muscles move? So going back to Francis Galton, if you want to know how intelligent you are and you go to him, ang gagawin ni Galton, itetest niya, i-measure niya gaano kaganda ang functioning ng iyong sensory motor skills. Again, we call that the sensory motor view of intelligence. That's why you have to realize during those times, if you go to Galton and he will test your intelligence, ibang-iba yung items na mga ibibigay niya sa'yo compared to the items that we are so used to taking today. So for example, you go to Galton and then you want your intelligence measured, ang papagawa niya sa'yo is, for example, papakount niya sa'yo yung isang target stimulus using your eyes. For example, I want you to count the number of times that you are going to see my fist. Any other things that you see, you disregard. You just count the number of times you see my fist. Ready? Okay? So your ability to answer that correctly, kung tama ba yung bilang mo, ilang beses lumabas yung fist, that is an indication of your intelligence according to the Galton view. The same thing with auditory. Papagawa sa iyo ni Galton, magpapatunog siya ng iba't ibang mga sounds. He's going to select which sound you need to count kung ilang beses mong narinig. All the other sounds you ignore. For example, if I ask you to simply count the number of times you are going to hear this, all the other sounds you ignore. Ready? Again, your ability to accurately count the number of times you heard that sound refers to your intelligence. Ganon magsukat ng intelligence si Francis Galton. Now, let's not miss a very important implication of Galton's approach in measuring intelligence. I hope you realize na again, during those times, during the early days of psychometrics, test takers were given tasks to do for intelligence to be measured. Hindi items ang binibigay sa mga sinaunang test takers. Very different from our test takers today. Usually, if you are a test taker today taking a psychological test, meron tayong ganyang picture, di ba? A person is sitting down, bibigyan mo ng answer sheet, bibigyan mo ng questionnaire, the person will answer the questionnaire using the answer sheet, and that's psychological testing today. But that was not how psychological testing started. It's very performance-based. You are going to perform tasks that will show how good your sensory motor skills are. Ganun yung sinaunang psychological testing. Kaya nga, sa London, England, there is this very popular place called Anthropometric Laboratory na pinatayo ni Francis Galton. In this laboratory, this is the center where people's intelligence are being measured using the different techniques that Galton developed. But again, to summarize the techniques that he developed, lahat ng pinapagawa sa iyo sa anthropometric laboratory are designed to measure your sensory motor skills. This is where this guy enters the picture, si Mr. Carl Pearson. If you are a psych major, the term Pearson will be very familiar kasi yung term na yan, that's very statistical. Carl Pearson is the one who developed the formula for Pearson's R. And if you remember in psychology, dapat ma-remember mo, hindi mo dapat malimutan ito, no? Pearson's R is being used to measure the relationship between two psychological variables. Kung gusto mong malaman gaano kalakas ang link, gaano kalakas ang connection between variable 1 and variable 2, ang gagawin mo, you're going to quantify those two variables and then you are going to correlate those two variables using Pearson's R. And from there, yung coefficient na makukuha mo, yung Pearson's R, will tell you how strong is the link between those two psychological variables. Nung naimbento ito ni Carl Pearson, this became a perfect opportunity to give support to the idea of Galton that one's intelligence is related or it's linked to one's sensory motor skills. Diba? Perfect opportunity yan. And how would we do that? I-correlate natin yung mga scores that people get inside his anthropometric laboratory, and then let's also get the grades that these people are getting in their schools. And then, i-correlate natin yung mga numbers na yan. So, I hope you get the logic. Get the numbers, get the raw scores, anthropometric lab, get the grades that they get in school, and then you correlate those two numbers, those two variables. Now, They did that. At ang naging resulta, when they correlated these two scores, ang hina ng relationship between their grades or their scores in the anthropometric laboratory and the school grades that they are getting inside the schools. Kung baga, kung tatagalugin natin para mas maging simple, nalaman nila na halos walang connection, walang link yung sensory motor skills ng mga tao sa kanilang kakayanan inside the school. Hindi sila link, walang kinalaman, weak ang relationship. In fact, to be more specific, almost close to zero ang relationship. So para mo nang sinabi na yung relationship ng kulay ng rubber shoes mo sa kung uulan o hindi, 'di ba? Wala naman talagang epekto 'yon, walang link yung kulay ng rubber shoes mo sa weather na mararanasan mo, ganun kahina yung relationship that they observe in correlating these two scores. Given this, marami mga tao nagduda sa sinasabi ni Francis Galton that one's intelligence is reflected by his or her sensory motor skills. And that's understandable. Kasi kung talagang merong connection, yung sensory motor skills mo sa talino mo, di sana yung nakuha nilang correlation dito mataas. Ang problema, hindi nga mataas. Halos walang correlation, which tells us that to believe that your sensory motor skills has something to do with your intelligence and vice versa, your intelligence has something to do with your sensory motor skills, hindi pala tama. So, nasira na, nawala na, no? Maraming mga tao, they already let go of that belief that intelligence is linked to your sensory motor skills. Dito na ngayon pumasok sa eksena si Alfred Binet, who was a French guy, and the main approach or the main contribution of Binet was he provided people with an alternative view of intelligence. Dahil nawala na nga yung sensory motor view ni Francis Galton, sabi ni Binet, this is a way better method to understand human intelligence. Ito yung tinatawag nating verbal view of intelligence. According to Binet, if you want to know how smart a person is, you measure his or her ability to use language, to use words, to understand and use words. Kaya nga doon kinuha yung salitang verbal, no? The verbal view of intelligence. So if you go to Alfred Binet, ipapameasure mo yung intelligence mo sa kanya, ibang-iba naman yung approach niya compared to Galton. Alfred Binet will be targeting your ability to understand language. And one of the ways to test kung magaling ka ba gumamit ng language is your comprehension skill. Magaling ka bang umintindi ng mga salita? So for example, kung pupunta ka kay Binet, gusto mong malaman gaano ka katalino, sasagutin mo yung item na ito. John is the son of Mark, who is the friend of John's gym trainer Jim, who is the friend of Mark's wife Jenna. Given that, tatanungin ka, what is the relationship of Mark and Jim? Kapag nasagot mo yan ng tama, ibig sabihin yan, magaling kang mag-operate ng words in your mind. Magaling ka umintindi ng mga concepts. Kasi para masagot mo yan, dapat naiintindihan mo yung ibig sabihin ng friend. Anong ibig sabihin ng wife? Anong pinagkaiba ng wife sa friend? Anong ibig sabihin ng son? Anong pinagkaiba ng son sa friend? Anong pinagkaiba ng son sa trainer? So on and so forth. So, ganun ang approach ni Alfred Binet. Your ability to understand words, use words, solve problems using words, the verbal view of intelligence. That's why, again, Alfred Binet, given his approach, he developed his own version of an intelligence test na tinawag na 1905 scale. Originally, this test merong 30 items. Pero, ang isang special feature ng test na ito is, talagang this test is well known for this test has the ability to quantify your intelligence to a specific unit. Kung ang tubig merong unit of measure, kung ang bigat merong unit of measure, for the first time in the history of psychology, meron ng unit of measure ang intelligence. At yun yung tinatawag niyang IQ or intellectual quotient or intelligence quotient in some textbooks. So if you want to know the overall intelligence that you are capable of as a person, kailangan mo malaman yung IQ mo. And Alfred Binet devised a way by taking his test to measure your IQ. Yan yung pinaka nagpasikat sa test ni Alfred Binet na na-reduce niya sa isang unit of measure yung katalinuhan ng tao. And to make the long story short, when Binet developed the 1905 scale, it became very successful. Kumbaga, kaya siya naging successful, it was very accurate in differentiating students who are smart enough to go to school and students who are not yet ready to go to school. Kaya ito na yung naging official test na ginagamit ng French Ministry of Education. Now, after the development of Binet's 1905 scale, marami pang mga events na nangyari. No? So again, since this is only a summarized version of the history of psychometrics, kayo na lang bahala magbasa doon sa mga iba pang nangyari after the development of 1905 scale. Ang gagawin natin dito, magpa-fast forward tayo all the way to Louis Terman. Now, ano naman ang papel ni Louis Terman sa history of psychometrics? Narinig ng United States of America yung success story ng 1905 scale. Now, during those times in America, they were starting to establish their school system. And they also want the 1905 scale kasi gagamitin din nila yon kung papaano ginamit ito ng mga French. They are going to use this to screen students who will enter the school and students who are not yet ready to go to school. So gusto nila ng 1905 scale na yan. So ang ginawa nila, in-import nila. They found a way to import the original French 1905 scale developed by Binet, in-import sa Amerika. And that was where Louis Terman was assigned by the US government to head the process of adapting the 1905 scale to the American society. Alam naman natin in psychometrics, di ba? If you plan to use a foreign test, you get a foreign test from somewhere and you want to use that in your local place, ang gagawin mo muna dapat, i-adapt mo muna. You are going to modify that foreign test in a form where it becomes more appropriate to local usage para magamit ng mga tao sa sarili mong bansa. At ano ba yung mga bagay sa test na kailangan i-modify if you are going to adopt a foreign test? Of course, the language. From French, gagawing English. And Louis Terman also added some items which he thinks is more appropriate for the American test takers. To make the long story short, by the way, madugong proseso yan, no? Yung test adaptation. Iko-convert mo yung foreign test to a locally made test. That is a very tedious process, but to make the long story short, Terman was successful doing that. Doon na ngayon pinanganak yung Stanford Binet Intelligence Test. Bakit Stanford Binet? The word Stanford came from the university where Terman was working nung ginawa niya yung test modification to give credit to the school where he was working on. Okay? Yung Binet naman, of course, is to give credit to the originator, to the author of the test that he was adapting. Kaya nga tinawag na Stanford Binet Intelligence Test. And one thing about Stanford Binet Intelligence Test, this is an individual type of test. Ibig sabihin yan, in the field of psychometrics, this is a test designed to be administered one-on-one. As we go along, here in Libreng Sit-In, meron tayong episode where I'm going to discuss the difference between individual test versus group test. Yung group test naman, these are tests that are being administered in a group basis. For the meantime, Stanford Binet Intelligence Test is an individual test. So kapag in-administeran ka ng isang individual test such as Stanford, dalawa lang ang tao ang dapat nandyan. Nandyan yung psychometrician at syempre nandoon yung test taker. That's why it's called an individual test. Now, let's pause a little bit and let's analyze, let's process yung mga ginawa, yung mga contribution ni Alfred Binet at saka ni Louis Terman. Again, both of these guys contributed big time to the field of testing. Pero kung merong isang talagang epekto si Binet at si Terman na nagawa na sobrang laki hanggang ngayon nangyayari pa rin, no? Because of their efforts, for the first time in human history, we can now classify people according to their levels of intelligence. Dahil alam na natin paano sukatin ang katalinuhan ng tao through the IQ, we use that to categorize people according to their intellectual capability. Kaya nga doon na nanggaling yung mga terms that, we use na may kinalaman sa katalinuhan, genius, superior intelligence, very superior intelligence, yung iba above average, normal, dullness, borderline deficiency, definite feeble-mindedness. Now take note, these words na binasa ko are words that are already ancient. Ginagamit itong mga terms na ito during early times of psychometrics. Today, hindi na ginagamit yung mga ganyang terms kasi nag-evolve na yan. Marami ng mga terms ngayon about a person's intelligence politically incorrect. For example, yung feeble-mindedness. That is a very politically incorrect term in today's standard. But it used to be, wala silang problema sa paggamit ng label na feeble-mindedness. And just a little bit of trivia, yung feeble-mindedness na yan, if your IQ is below 70, meron pa yung subcategories. Kung ikaw ay below 70, you can be called an idiot, an imbecile, or a moron. Depending again on the IQ that you get. Kapag less than 20, yun ang tawag sa'yo. 20 to 49, yun ang tawag sa'yo. 50 to 69, yun naman ang tawag sa'yo. But again, let me repeat, these words are no longer being used today. They are now considered politically incorrect. Mas marami na tayong mga terms ngayon na mukhang mas makatao ang label at yun na yung ginagamit sa modern day psychometrics. So, in the future, kapag psychometrician ka na, wag mong gagamitin yung mga words na yan when you write your assessment report. Now, what happened next? The United States of America declared joining World War I, and US joining the World War became an event that also moved forward the history of psychometrics. Of course, during times of war, gusto mo na yung mga sundalo na makukuha mo from your citizenry, mga matatalino. Kasi mahalaga na malaman mo yung level ng katalinuhan ng mga army personnel so you would know where to assign them. Sino ang mag-o-office work? Sino ang ipapadala sa field? Sino ang magiging general? Sino ang magiging strategy head? 'Di ba? Depende yan sa talino ng mga sundalo. So, you again need a tool that will measure soldiers' levels of intelligence for you to do this. Kung gusto mong malaman gaano katalino yung mga sundalo mo, gagamit ka na naman ng isang intelligence test to do that. Now, remember during this time, they already developed the Stanford-Binet intelligence test, but they did not use this for this purpose. Ang dahilan, if you can follow my line of thinking, it's very impractical. Hindi kasi practical dahil one-on-one test itong Stanford-Binet. Kapag ginawa mo yan, baka tapos na ang gera, hindi ka pa tapos mamili ng mga sundalo na sasabak sa gera. Masyadong matagal. And this is where Robert Yerkes enters the picture. Inatasan si Robert Yerkes na pasimulan na gumawa ng mga tinatawag na group intelligence tests. So the US Army commissioned this guy to develop the first forms of group intelligence tests. These are psychological tests, intelligence tests that are designed to be administered in group setting. Pwedeng sabay-sabay. 40 katao, sabay-sabay nagtetest. 50 katao, sabay-sabay nagtetest. Very unlike the individual test. Now, yung unang group intelligence test na na-develop ni Robert Yerkes, ang pangalan is the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. The difference between the two tests, yung alpha para sa mga sundalo na nakakabasa at nakakasulat, so most of the items in that test are in word form, verbal form, while the Army Beta was for soldiers who are illiterate, yung mga hindi marunong magbasa o magsulat, so most of the items in Army Beta are very non-verbal. In fact, we can say no na ito yung parang one of the earliest forms of non-verbal intelligence test. Pag-uusapan ulit natin yan as we go along. No? Anong pinagkaiba ng verbal intelligence test sa non-verbal intelligence test? But again, going back to Robert Yerkes, his development of Army Beta became one of the first forms of non-verbal intelligence test. Fast forward, after ng gera, edi syempre, nagkaroon na ng kapayapaan, hindi na kinakailangan ng intelligence test to screen soldiers, 'di ba? Kasi tapos na nga yung gera eh. So yung Army Alpha and Army Beta nakatambak lang sa opisina ng US Army. Now, there were some psychologists during those times nang hinayang sila sa mga test na ito. Sabi nila, why don't we revive this test, develop it again, make some modifications, add some items, and then we can use this test for other purposes. Like for example, again, why don't we use it for schools? Kasi again, nagsisimula sila sa pag-establish ng education system nila, di ba? So, imbis na mag-Stanford Binet ang mga estudyante one-on-one basis, para mas mabilis, damihan natin, no? Yung 40 students kukuha ng test, dapat ganun ang setup para mabilis. And that's what they did. And this is now one of the roots or one of the springboards kung bakit tayo merong modern day entrance exams. 'Di ba? Halos lahat ng universities ngayon, before you can enroll in that school, you need to take their entrance exam. And entrance exams is a form of a group test. 'Di ba? 50 katao, 60 katao pwedeng kumuha ng exam na yon all at the same time. And later on, these tests were also used for employee hiring, specifically recruitment. Pwede na rin nating masabi na ito ay precursor ng industrial organizational psychology. Again, specifically the recruitment process. Now, after everything that we have discussed about the short history of psychometrics, there are 4 lessons in history I want you to learn. After all, yan naman talaga ang point. Bakit nag-aaral ng history? To learn lessons. Number 1, I hope you realize that the main essence of using psychological test is for decision making. Bilang isang psychologist in the future, hindi ka pwedeng gumawa ng isang desisyon kung wala kang basis. And the basis that you are going to hold on to justify your decision, to justify your recommendation, usually comes from the use of a certain psychological test. In history, we saw this happening. 'Di ba? Lahat ng purpose, lahat ng situation na kinailangan ng psychological test, it's for decision-making purposes eh. In school, in war, later on in the industry, and much later on in the clinic, it's all about decision making. So ang application dito, if you are a professional psychologist, majority of your decisions, majority of your recommendations must be justified by the results that you get from administrating psychological tests. Number 2, I hope you also realize that intelligence have many definitions. Walang isang single definition of intelligence na masasabi nating yun lang yung tama. And we saw that, when we remembered Alfred Binet and we remembered Francis Galton. Although they both talk about human intelligence, they look at it in 2 different ways. Iba sila ng pananaw, iba sila ng pagkakaintindi kung ano ang ibig sabihin ng katalinuhan ng tao. And this idea has a very big implication to intelligence testing in general. Kasi dahil maraming definitions of intelligence, that explains why we have a number of intelligence tests. Kasi very common question ito no, ng mga tao outside psychometrics. Bakit ang dami-daming klase ng IQ test, eh, isang isang construct lang naman, intelligence lang naman yung mine-measure natin. 'Di ba? Parang ano, parang yung mga haba ng mga objects, 'di ba? Kapag ang pinag-uusapan haba ng objects, definitely ruler 'yan or tape measure 'yan. Yun lang yung gagamitin mo, wala nang iba. Now, how come that is not true when we talk about intelligence? Why do we use different tools with different names if we are only measuring one thing, which is intelligence? Ang sagot, at dapat alam nyo to para pag may nagtanong, ito yung isasagot nyo, because different psychologists have different understanding of what intelligence is. Iba-iba sila ng definition, iba-iba sila ng indicators of intelligence. Yun yung nag-explain kung bakit ang dami-dami nating klase ng intelligence test. Bakit iba yung CFIT sa Ravens, iba pa yung Wechsler, iba pa yung Gardner, iba pa yung Sternberg. Bakit? Iba-iba sila ng pananaw on what human intelligence is. In fact, ito, oversimplified pa nga yan, no? I-fast forward mo pa yung history of intelligence research. Modern day psychology have identified other forms of intelligences that were not present during the early times of psychology. Halimbawa, meron tayong EQ. Hindi lang pala dapat minimeasure yung IQ, pati yung EQ dapat minimeasure. Dapat minimeasure mo rin yung practical intelligence mo. Psychologists found out that your intelligence inside the classroom is different from your intelligence in everyday life. Maraming tao magaling sa classroom, palpak sa everyday life. Meron din naman mga tao, magaling sa practical life, palpak naman sa classroom. Why? Because academic intelligence is different from practical intelligence. At meron na rin tayong tinatawag na SQ or spiritual intelligence, how good you are in dealing with things about life. How good are you in dealing things about your own existence? Gaano ka kagaling na alamin kung ano ang purpose mo? Paano ka kumo-connect sa higher being? Paano mo na nababasa kung saan ka papunta, kung ano yung goals mo? These are all small aspects of SQ or spiritual intelligence. And again, if you study psychometrics, ang dami-daming test sa market that can measure all these kinds of intelligences. Number 3, there are many ways to express intelligences and all are valid. Medyo related to ito sa number 2, no? Pero please don't fall into the danger of choosing, quote-unquote, the best definition of intelligence. Kasi yung ibang mga psychologist, may ganyang tendency, no, na sobrang idol niya si ganitong psychologist, dito lang siya maniniwala sa intelligence na ito. All the other, hindi totoo yung intelligence na yan. That is not the right attitude when we talk about human intelligence because it is a very complex psychological resource that we have. Hindi mo talaga mapipinpoint sa isang definition lang kung ano ang ibig sabihin ng katalinuhan. Now, modern day psychologists, marami sa kanila support that idea that we need to acknowledge that intelligence is more than just a person's ability to perform well in school. Merong mga klase ng katalinuhan na hindi nakikita sa loob ng classroom. Hindi nakakapture ng mga pa-short quiz ni sir, ng mga pa-recitation ni ma'am, ng mga palong exam ng iba't ibang mga universities. Pwedeng ang tao matalino pa rin kahit bagsak siya sa eskwelahan. Bakit? Kasi yung talino niya hindi nakikita sa loob ng eskwelahan, rather, it is being expressed in places outside the formal academic setting. Kaya nga si Howard Gardner, isa sa mga psychologist na aprobado dyan. Kaya nga niya ginawa yung multiple intelligences model. 'Di ba? That we need to acknowledge that there are other intelligences out there that we need to acknowledge more than just the traditional intelligences that we value in school. Lalong-lalo na, 'di ba? Napaka-bias natin sa verbal intelligence, at mathematical intelligence. Without us realizing it, marami pang mga intelligences out there that are as valid as those academically inclined forms of intelligences. And number 4, and I'm going to close with this, another lesson that we can learn is no one size fits all intelligence test. Walang intelligence test na one size fits all. Hindi pwedeng pipili ka lang ng isang IQ test tapos lahat ng kliyente ko ito ang gagamitin ko. No. The fact that there are many ways how to define intelligence and all are valid, that will make you think. That should make you realize na dapat i-consider mo yung konteksto ng client in choosing what IQ test to use. The keyword here is context. Bago ka pumili ng isang IQ test na ibibigay mo sa kliyente mo, sa dinami-dami ng IQ test in the market, ano ang pipiliin mo? Alamin mo yung context. Like what? Yung setting. 'Di ba? Nasaan ba yung setting nyo? Bakit ba yung kliyente mo pumunta sa'yo? Meron ba siyang clinical case? Or merong isang kumpanya, no, industrial setting ang nagpapameasure sa'yo ng intelligence niya? Or meron ba tong kinalaman sa eskwelahan kung bakit niya kailangan magpa-IQ test? You start there. What setting is your client involved in na kinakailangan niya malaman yung IQ test niya? Because it would differ. There are IQ tests specifically used for clinical setting. There are IQ tests for education setting. There are IQ tests for industrial organizational setting. Number 2, kinakailangan tugma yung definition mo ng intelligence sa kung anong klaseng test yung ibibigay mo doon sa kliyente. Dito medyo papasok dito talaga medyo papasok yung iyong philosophy as a psychometrician, no? Like, for example, you really believe that this definition of intelligence is the one that fits the context of your client. Okay? So, given the context of the client, halimbawa, clinical context, hahanap ka ngayon ng isang definition of intelligence na tugma doon sa konteksto na clinical context. So, huwag kang gagamit ng isang IQ test that is very academic yung background kung ang case mo ay clinical and vice versa. Huwag ka rin gagamit ng isang IQ test na ang definition niya ng intelligence is very clinical, pero yung tao na kukuha ng test, gagamitin niya yung results for academic purposes. Dapat tugma yung definition of intelligence with the setting. And lastly, number 3, may kinalaman ito sa ethics. You choose the intelligence test na kaya mong i-handle. Because again, as you will learn, as we go along here in Libreng Sit-In, merong mga IQ test na merong prerequisite skills dapat na nire-require yung psychometrician who will handle that IQ test. If you already know that you are not capable handling that IQ test, you don't know how it works, you don't know how to score it, you don't know how to interpret it properly, you don't know the background of this test, you don't have the capacity or the competence to handle the test, hindi mo dapat yan gagamitin. You will only use IQ tests that are within the bounds of your competence as a psychometrician. Pag-uusapan ulit natin yan when we begin to talk about ethics. So I hope marami kayong natutunan in our short episode today tungkol sa history of psychometrics. Thank you for listening, everyone. Have a great day and God bless.